Welcome to the Powell-Liberty Historical Society. I'm Tom Coffey, the board president. Tonight we are especially happy to be invited to this beautiful chapel and the barn church for a presentation by Tracy Scott about the history of the church, which is indeed a local historic tale. Tracy was born and raised in Delaware and remembers fondly playing in the Olentangy River and exploring the land that later became High Banks Metro Parks. She is a Hyatt's Elementary School, Olentangy High School, Miami U, and OSU graduate. Tracy taught for 35 years in the Olentangy schools, and she loved every minute of it. We thank Tracy for sharing her passion for the history with us as we learn more about the Liberty Presbyterian Church. And I'll now turn it over to Tracy.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I would very much like to thank Linda. Oh, thank you. You haven't heard me yet. If there's any applause at the end, I'll know you might have enjoyed it. And that's what I want you to do tonight. Sherry? Yes, I haven't seen you for a while, but I knew it was you. Sherry has actually done this talk for our Pioneer Day kids. And Sherry, I'm probably not as up to date as you are with all of that. I did teach for Olentangy actually for 25 years because I started my career at the School for the Deaf down on Morse Road. And I taught 8 years there and then stayed home to raise children and spent a couple of years teaching private preschool in Worthington and then taught for Olentangy for 25 years. So if I use my hands a lot tonight, you'll say, yes, I can tell she's a teacher of the deaf. I did grow up here in Delaware County, and so did my husband. I was a Hyatt's Elementary kiddo. Sherry, were you?
Powell.
You were Powell. Okay.
My husband was Hyatt.
He was Hyatt's, I know, because I know where their home is still there, the Carmichael home right there. And of course, Sherry knows I knew, let's see, it would be her sister-in-law, Stephanie, quite well growing up. The Carmichaels were just over the railroad track there in Hyattsville. And the Hyatt's Elementary is no longer there. My husband's Berlin Elementary is no longer there. His parents went to Berlin Elementary. His family came here in 1812. And so we have a very long history. My family came later. We were some of the migration from, West Virginia up to Ohio, from Appalachia, looking for work. Some of the family came up, and that would have been in the early 1900s. So my husband and I, one little claim to fame is that we were born at Grady Hospital, which was then Jane Case, and we were born 2 days apart. He was born on August 2nd, and I was born on August 4th, so we were in the nursery together. And we have now been married 50 years, so, I think it was meant to be from the beginning. Although there were moments in high school where I wasn't sure of that. We did meet in 7th grade, but that's kind of my history. Now, we all have histories. And we won't be able to share all of our histories, or we won't be talking much probably about Liberty Church history. But we all come to history differently in terms of our interest. And I know when my interest was piqued here at Liberty Church. I know exactly the moment it happened. And I know that my husband's interest in World War II was because his uncle and father were both in the Battle of the Bulge. They were little Ohio farm boys raised here. They went for a couple of months of training, and then they were sent over to the Battle of the Bulge. Both of them had Purple Hearts, but they lived. They were so glad to have had Purple Hearts because they saw a lot of other friends from this area killed in that battle. So I know exactly why he's so interested in World War II. But let's just a tiny bit of sharing. Do you know the moment or where your interest in history began? Because you are here, because you love history. Probably not for really any other reason. When did your interest in history begin? Anybody willing to share?
Sure.
Yes.
When I was 4th grade, we got 4010, or fourth grade was when you studied Ohio history.
Okay.
That's what my interest.
Ohio history, right.
Fourth grade.
They still teach Ohio history in fourth grade because I taught fifth grade for some time, and our big map was the whole U.S. So it was U.S. history from the beginning of time to 1850 was, I don't know what it is now, but because I've been retired now for about 10 years. Anybody else? Thank you, Nancy. I mean, any particular incident or anything? Yes.
I was probably about 10 years old and had a conversation with my grandmother and learned that they had immigrated from Czechoslovakia out to Indiana, which is where we're from. And I think that sparked an interest for me. So it was interesting learning about new cultures and places that they had been or come and why they had come here. So
and why they had come here. Thank you.
Hi, I actually have taken an interest in this particular church because I was a news reporter for OLNTNG This Week News, which some of you guys probably get. And when they were building the development across the street, I interviewed someone who was moving the old houses that used to be there, and he was taking them and rebuilding them other places. And they talked a lot about how the people who lived there went to this church. Some of them are buried out in the cemetery, and ever since I've wanted to come learn about it.
Well, we're glad that you did. Yeah, usually it's something that, something that sparks our interest. And remembering the past, I think really helps us go forward. Particularly, those of us who are believers, remember how good God has been to us all this time. Here on the banks of the Olentangy River. That wasn't called the Olentangy at all, and I bet you know what it was called. Somebody other than Sherry. Anybody know what the Olentangy River was called before it was the Olentangy?
Whetstone.
The Whetstone. Alan, you got it. Oh, you told him. You said vibes over. Okay, I knew you knew. And Sherry, actually, I will appreciate, at any time, if you want to jump in, because I don't promise that I won't make mistakes. We know history from what we know, not what we don't know, and what we forget. And I even wrote down little cards with dates because I thought, I don't know that I can deal with all those dates, and I could get some of the dates wrong. I mean, it's easy to do that. I'm going to do the best I can. I was never really a history teacher, because I taught elementary and I taught all subjects. But I can tell you the exact moment when I became interested here at Liberty Church in the history of this whole area. I was sitting out in the churchyard, and it was in 1982. We were having a children's ministry meeting, small group of us just sitting there on a beautiful night, just like tonight. It was no different. And all of a sudden, a red fox ran through the churchyard. And that red fox just never left my mind. It was like, okay, a red fox. I hadn't seen a red fox in Ohio until that point. Even all through my childhood, I didn't. But that moment took me back in time, and I remember talking with Pastor David Redding, who was here for 29 years, and he was quite a history buff. Oh, he loved history. And he loved the old history, and I remember talking to him about all of that. And then actually, very soon after that, I went to work for Olentangy teaching, and I taught third grade for 10 years. And because of that experience, it just never left me. I started learning more about the history of this area and about the early settlers. And I found out that we were supposed to be teaching in social studies how a community is formed. Well, how is a community formed? Little by little. Now, it seems like a big wave of community coming into us over the last 20 or 30 years here. But it was little by little the community was formed. The Native American community was here first. And before that, the mound builders way back, and you've seen some of the mounds that they've constructed, some of the earthenware and I think they're called earthworks. And then there were Native American tribes, and we know those tribes because we know the names of different places around us. So Sherry, what was one of the tribes? Wyandots. The Wyandots. I taught at Wyandotte Elementary. Wyandotte this and Wyandotte that around here, isn't it? So Wyandottes. Anybody know another one?
Delaware.
The Delawares. Yeah, the Delaware. And certainly we are in Delaware County. We've got Delaware City. So we had the Delawares. Anybody else with another?
Tarhee?
Okay, I don't know that one, but how do you know that?
Well, I just know it as an area. It's an area. I was an Indian guide. I was a chief.
Wonderful.
So the Tarhee tribe.
The Tarhee tribe.
It was like the Wyandottes.
Yes.
And they were another tribe maybe in the western, Franklin County, Delaware County area.
Well, thank you. That's something new.
Tarhee.
Tarhee.
Yeah, Tarhee.
My information mostly comes from David Redding's wonderful book, all done in calligraphy, called Liberty Church Beginnings. So I don't think he had anything about Tarhee in here. You can see how beautiful this is, though, with all the calligraphy. But Tarhee, I'll put that in my head. There are others, though, that you may be familiar with. The Shawnee. You know Shawnee Hills. So we've got the Shawnee. Mingo. I grew up swimming at Mingo Pool. That was the only pool around. So we went into Delaware. All my swimming lessons were at Mingo Pool. And then the other one, Seneca's, that I have. Are there others? You've got Tarhee. Do you know any others, Indian Guide?
Well, Cherokee.
Were they around here too?
Around here.
Okay.
They were more in
Okay.
Central, southeast Ohio area, but
Okay.
Cherokee.
The Cherokee. And I'm sure there were many others too that either were in somewhere here in Ohio. These were the ones that David Redding noted, particularly in this area. And when we would be having worship in this particular chapel, which at the time didn't look anything like this, because I started coming to Liberty in 1980. And the chapel was set up totally different because we could seat 237, I believe. It was this room, the room next door where there's a meeting tonight, and that was an add-on room. And then and then part of the narthex out beyond that had been built on. It had been added in the 70s, I think in 76. The lower level. So, gradually the church changed, and we actually worshiped in this direction. These windows were all covered over, but then when John and Becky Hart came, who were here, they started here about 16 years ago, we changed all of this and took it back to the old original chapel because we needed office space. We needed meeting rooms. We had lots going on campus. Like tonight, we've got the Boy Scouts. We've got another meeting over here. We've got a big meeting up in the Carriage House. So there are lots of different places here. But returning this was just wonderful. We have our Lenten services in here. Nancy, do you and David, you've been to those Lenten services? Yeah. And we just rock this place with the old time religion. And that is a time when Liberty folks really go back to remembering our history and singing some of the old time songs. And these are all new. The pews are new. The church was built in 1820. And David Redding used to talk about the fact that there were Native American paths going right by these windows. And on Sunday mornings, they would come and walk along. I don't know if he really knew this, if this was, had been told over the generations, but they would come and walk along, and the relations were good. And they would peek in the windows during worship. So that is in his book, that they're peeking in the windows. So you can kind of think about that tonight. One story he loved to tell we always have a historical Sunday where we go back in time, and we used to really dress the part. We don't so much anymore, but we really do pass on to the next generation. Can you picture in your head that these trees were so close together, like they are down by the river? And the trees were so close together that a squirrel could jump all the way to the Ohio River. He always told this one, all the way to the Ohio River without ever touching the ground. So, you have to put your imaginations into full gear. But that time I saw that red fox, and it never left my head, that year and how a community's formed, it just grew and grew and grew into Pioneer Day for third graders. And third graders all across the district have done Pioneer Day for years and years. Now I understand that recently that's changed, but for many, many years, I would say more than 30, Pioneer Day existed. And I don't know what schools do in place to talk about how a community is formed, but bringing all those 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds here and letting them be out in the cemetery, doing gravestone rubbings and learning about the early settlers here. They loved it. And we, of course, baked biscuits, and early on, we made everything, a lot of things from the Laura Ingalls Wilder cookbook, because the kids loved it. And we would have venison and corn dishes and lima beans and everything that, that was in that Laura Ingalls Wilder cookbook. We would have that for the kids. And they would make them at home and bring them in. And their aunts and uncles and grandpas and grandmas would come. And I don't know if you remember some of those early days, Sherry, but we'd be out in the shelter house then, and it would be all much more authentic recipes. So fun to celebrate history. Something we're going to do tonight is talk a little bit about the old chapel, but then I'd like to know my audience. So, are you interested in spending any time in the cemetery? If you are, please raise your hand. Okay, so we're gonna do this in like 20 minutes so we can go out there and you can roam around. Anybody interested in seeing the new barn? Have you been over to the new barn? Yes? All right, if you're interested, raise your hand. Okay, because we'll go over and we'll see the new barn. It's pretty cool because the Amish and the English came together on that project and built one of the very largest stone end barns in the whole U.S., and I think the largest ever used as a church here in the U.S. Okay, we're going back to early times, 1810. Let's go back even earlier than that. The early families came here because there was a land rush. Some have equated this land rush to the gold rush in California. And this was in the early 1800s here in Ohio. And you probably, I see nodding, so some of you know about this land rush. Early 1800s. Before that even, they were selling the land. And the land, 4,000 acres of that land at $1.37 an acre went to Thomas Seller. And he bought that land, if you can imagine, all the way from, it's past what's now Home Road, not quite to Orange Road, all the way up to Hyatt's Road. And he owned, 4,000 acres of this land. And that was in the late 1770s sometime. It was the late 1700s anyway. And then in 1800, he said, I've got to go to Ohio. I have my land. This is like my parents did in Florida. They bought swamp at one point. And then eventually they had to go see the swamp they'd bought. And then eventually they moved to that swamp that was no longer a swamp because the city was being built. Well, there had started being a lot of rumblings for people to come from the Northeast, from Maryland, from Virginia, from Pennsylvania. And if they had fought in the Revolutionary War, they got land grant. And so I don't, do you know how many acres came as part of their, I'm not sure how many acres, but they gave the soldiers land.
The land companies were buying up a lot of the soldiers' allotment because
I'm sure.
not everybody wanted to come.
Not
So
everybody did want to come.
the Ohio Land Company began to sell off land here.
Okay,
big
that's
time.
good to know. Yeah, I can imagine that happening.
Yeah.
Because not everybody probably thought that was a gift.
Not everybody wanted to come.
But some did. And some came with that, and others bought that land from the land companies, the real estate companies back then.
Right.
And they weren't called real estate. What were they? Land?
It was the Ohio Land Company and the Scioto Land
Okay.
Company that were the two around here.
Okay. Ohio Land Company and Scioto Land Company. Thomas Seller and Sarah came to Ohio right after Nathan Carpenter. And many of you know that Nathan Carpenter in 1801 was the earliest white settler in this particular area. And then shortly after that, because I also see figures that say that Thomas Seller and Sarah came in 1801, so it wasn't much longer. And then they established a residence here. By 1802, they had residency here. So it was shortly after Nathan Carpenter built a small wood log home. That's what they all did when they came. They chopped down what they had were the trees. So they chopped them down and they built these very rudimentary homes that for a while until they could build a better home. And then eventually they did that. And Nathan Carpenter, the first white settler here in this area, have you ever seen his spring house over at Marycrest? Okay, it's just, it's really a wonderful place. It's on Greif Brothers' property on Taggart Road. Chapman, oh, thank you for correcting that. Taggart and Chapman are kind of run on, yes, they continue on, Chapman Road. Okay, on Chapman Road, I haven't been there for a long time. But as a kid, I went there because Maureen Dempsey Kendall was my dear friend. And so I would go and I would stay. Her dad, John Dempsey, owned that. Greif has been here a long time, and you have Greif Middle School, or Dempsey Middle School. It's not Greif Middle School. It's Dempsey Middle School in Delaware. And some of you may have seen that. But that's an old spring house that's made of stone. It's fabulous to see. And I can pass this around. You can take a look. I have, you know, I just started collecting all these things because, you know, you grow up here and then you realize that now you're going to this church starting here in 1980. But go ahead and pass that around. That's a picture of the old spring house that.
You say it's still there.
It's still there. It's beautiful. It looks just like that, actually. Well, it was beautiful the last time I saw it, which has been a little while. I say a little while, 20, 30 years probably. But I remember going inside and, you know, getting a chance to really see what it was all about. But it's pretty cool. Now, he didn't live in that home. That stone spring house covered the water source and protected them from any battles, any Native Americans who, you know, got a little too tipsy and came along the road and maybe, you know, they wanted to shut themselves in. So it was a fortress of sorts for them to protect them and also to protect the water supply because spring water was important if you're going to live through the winter here too, to have a protected source. So I think that's a pretty cool picture. Back to Thomas Seller then. He and Sarah, in the 4,000 acres, they set up a small home, and they have any number of other homes that went in to this area, and some of them were just north of this plot, and others were further out, closer to Hyatt Road. And one of the things that we learned about about Thomas Seller. 2 of his sons helped to build this church. He had died by that point, and he is buried. He died in 1816, and the church was established in 1810, but they met in homes of the settlers. So it was just, they were probably in Thomas Seller's home because he was one of the, first people interested in building a church here. But there were others. Others include the McKinneys. And his daughter, Thomas Seller's daughter, was married to Josiah McKinney. And Josiah McKinney, and you know a lot about this too. Have you really studied this?
Well, I volunteer at the Historical Society.
So you do talk about these kind of things all the time. No, I love it. I need to volunteer and learn more because, it helps if you're repeating it instead of waiting 10 years to talk about this again, But the McKinneys are also buried in our churchyard out here. So Thomas and Sarah are buried out there. We have the McKinneys buried out here, so we may be able to find their stones indeed tonight. And then another one of the founding fathers, because they were indeed founding males, was Captain Leonard Monroe. And he was known dearly to us and to David Redding, our pastor, as Deacon Monroe, because he served on the governing body. He was in the Revolutionary War, so he was captain in the Revolutionary War. He actually fought with George Washington and crossed the Delaware River on the 25th of December, the night of Christmas. Actually, it would have been the 24th because it was Christmas Eve, in 1976 to defeat the Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey, okay? So that's, he was part of that group. Did you have something to add?
Oh, no, we were just saying 1776.
Did I say 1776? Oh, did I say 1976? 1776. Do you know what? I think you all knew that was 1776. 1776, December 24th, Christmas Eve night. And we think that's pretty cool. But the other thing that we love to tell the old story about Captain Monroe, Deacon Monroe, is that he was called the barefoot deacon because there were so many people who really didn't have shoes and said, I can't come to church, I don't have a pair of shoes, okay? And the families would say, y'all wear shoes to church. No, I'm sorry, we can't come, we don't have shoes. And he, because of that, he would take his shoes off on Sunday mornings and put them, outside where they could see them for sure, and he'd sit with his feet out in the aisle. And they would see that he sat there barefooted, so he was called the barefoot deacon, and they would come in then, they would feel free to come in. We've always been a come-as-you-are church. This would be a fine look on a Sunday morning here at Liberty Church, okay? When I first came here in 1980, I came by myself one Sunday morning. My husband was home with the 2 little ones, a baby and a 3-year-old. And I went home and I said, honey, you're going to like this church. They're worshiping outside on the lawn and you can wear shorts. And we've been here ever since. He came the next Sunday and we've been here ever since. And it's way more than that brought us to Liberty Church. Like I said, all over these years, God has been so good to this wonderful place here. We have about 17 acres, a little less than 17 acres. We have had the provision of ongoing pastors. We have not been without a pastor, and we've had wonderful ones, and some of them we know better than others. And one of them is our first pastor. And that was Joseph Smith Hughes. Now, do you know the name Hughes from being in Delaware County? How many of you have been in Delaware County a long time? Okay. And the rest of you are all newbies to Delaware County? Well, 89, that's pretty long, but you might not know this history. But I bet those of you who've been here a long time know about the Delaware Gazette and who founded the first newspaper Well, it was Pastor Joseph Smith Hughes, who was our first pastor here. And he had a pastorate where he went from church to church. And so he was in Radnor, he was in Delaware, which later became First Pres, and he was in Radnor, and he was here at Liberty. And David Redding reenacted Pastor Hughes, and one weekend, he got up real early at the crack of dawn before it was even light out and rode his horse to all 3 of the churches that Joseph Hughes served. And that was really neat. We had that on video. My husband was actually the videographer. So, he wanted to remember that early pastorate. Now, Joseph Hughes started the newspaper, which later became the Delaware Gazette. And then he was the publisher of that newspaper. And later, I have family who were publishers. The Thompsons are part of my family. And if you know anything about the Delaware Gazette and the heritage of the newspaper, for a long time it was the Thompsons. And that's where I first heard about Joseph Hughes, was through the new Thompson publishers, who were not new, they were a long time ago now, but they told me those old stories of Joseph Hughes and how he started the paper, which I think is pretty cool. Also, Masons, he was a member of the Masons in Delaware, very active. And when he died, which was in 1823, there were a lot of things going around then. It wasn't COVID, but there were a lot of things. And this one was called Cold Plague Epidemic. That's what, and I don't even know what the Cold Plague Epidemic was, but it was 1822, 1823. And so he died at that time. He was pastor from 1810, even before this building was built, to 1823. And, he died and they buried him. I found this really interesting. They buried him east of Ohio Wesleyan, where the Ohio Wesleyan campus is, east of, the river and everything. And then along came his, much later, and how much later? Let me see if I can see that. I don't see it here, but it was much later, like right here. 1900, he was reburied in Oak Grove because his family came along and he was in an unmarked grave. And he had really been well known in all of Delaware County. And so they exhumed his body and reburied him. Other interesting things, we still have a member here, Mary Jo Brown Blue, who is a descendant of Joseph Hughes. And she tells the old stories about his wife Elizabeth and the small trunk that she has when his wife came from Ireland, and Mary Jo still has that old trunk. So when you hear the descendants, it's really interesting, especially when I first came here in 1980, to know the number of people who were descendants of the original founders of the church. Sellers, Bernie Sellers. I bet you knew him. I did too. Well, I had his granddaughter Chelsea in my 5th grade class, Chelsea Seller. Your daughter, TK. Yes. I thought that was you, but your brother too, and we haven't seen each other. So, do you want to say, TK, TK is Bernie's son. And do you want to say any more about that? Because you have some of the old, Bernie came into our classroom, and I don't know if it was the year I had Chelsea, whom I loved so very dearly. You love all your kids too. Chelsea was memorable, and in part because of the history she brought with her and brought into our classroom, and that was really such an interesting thing. But about the rifle and the sword
You're doing fine. I don't want to.
No, really, TK. I thought that was you, but I wasn't sure.
We haven't seen each other for a while.
No, it's been a while, but it's great to have you here.
Thanks.
He's the man with the real family history, all the way back to Thomas Seller. We call that area out there Seller Meadow. Your dad brought in a Revolutionary War rifle. Do you have that?
Yeah, Thomas Seller's got it.
Thomas Sellers. Right, it was his. And then also his sword. Wasn't it his sword? Okay. And I remember that.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
I think you can bring a gun.
Yeah, and swords. And swords.
Even though it didn't work, you can't do it now. But I still have the college. I can actually make a sound out of it.
Because the only other thing about the old chapel, look around, hand-hewn beams, but some we know that some came from Thomas Sellers and Nathan Carpenter's mills. They had lumber mills. And so we know some of the wood came from that. 1820, two of Thomas's sons, John and George, were deeply involved in the building of this chapel. And we've got a lot of original wood, but other things are new. The wavy windows, there were this number of windows. You know, a lot of the history is still here, but none of the pews, these are all new. I don't know if those are original doors. That was added later. The vestibule, the bell tower, added later. The spire up on top. So I think that's where I'm going to end here, but let's go out and let's just see where the old schoolhouse was. Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Especially of TK.
TK.
TK, is it true that the graveyard was here before the church? That the graveyard was started before the church?
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Yes. You know, David Redding loved to tell the story that Lydia Sackett was the first grave in the graveyard. And she died in either 1812 or 1813. I had some conflicting information about that. And he always said that would have been the first, so that would have been before this building's built, but the church had been founded before that, but before this building was built. And then there were others, because a few right over here. They built the church right next to the cemetery. And he used to say it was this was built as a love letter to Lydia Sackett by John Flanagan Seller. She was his first sweetheart. He went on to marry Elizabeth, but she was his first sweetheart. So, you know, there are all kinds of fun facts. Let's go out here and I'm going to have somebody read a fun fact about the school. We had a schoolhouse here, and the school was built in 1827. Before that, they taught the children in the homes because it was very important to the Sellers. Where are you, TK? Very important to the Sellers that education was a part of what was going on. Faith in God and education. And those were
It's really interesting when they deeded the 3 acres to the Seller family, gave these 3 acres off of the 4,000.
Yeah.
That this land was dedicated for a burying ground, a place to worship, and a school. And here we are all these years later, except for the school, of course. It's still
burying
here.
ground. I love that, TK.
Mm-hmm.
Burying ground, a place of faith, a school. And the school was right over here. Well, interestingly, in 1848, it had 50 students at the school. However, by 1914, they couldn't even, and the way Lucy Knapp Taggart said it was, when we could not muster even 12 children to go to the school. So it had become a brick school. So it started out logs, and then it went to frame, and then it went to brick. So over those years, from 1827 to 1914, the school was right over here, but it had this different structure. But it was a small school, 18 by 20. If you can imagine a log school, 18 by 20, and then it became frame. But that step was used as the step up to the school. So, you know, that's always one of our scavenger hunt questions. We had a beautiful oak here that fell. And one of the pictures in there is of this oak that had been chopped into many logs. And if you were to peek into our narthex right here, you would see that there's a huge cross section of the log from 1976. And we started then another oak tree so that it would follow the exact roots of the original as it rotted. I mean, there's a lot of that kind of thing here. You saw the historical marker. when you came in. We're going to just look across at the barn. We call it the barn. We call the undercroft area when you go into the lower level, that's the BLL, the barn lower level. And all of us refer to it as the BLL here. So this is the admin building, second floor put on in the 70s, so for all the administration offices, old chapel, lots of small services there, small weddings, small memorial services. And then over here, everything imaginable goes on. We have a preschool down below. We added the shelter house, and of course we have weather vanes up on top, the Lamb of God, the lion, and then over here is the rooster that crowed 3 times to call Peter to repentance. And everything has symbolism that, and I believe that it did back in Thomas Seller's day too. I think they built this church with a lot of heart and a lot of faith. Cherry benches, Amish built. The floors are hickory, miles and miles and miles of hickory. And then the walnut pegs. I was saying that these beams delayed the construction of the barn because we had to go all over the U.S. looking for them. The Amish wouldn't sell to the English, and even though we were working with Josie Miller and his son Junior, and our construction manager was John Redding, who is the son of David Redding. So we had a close relationship. They were here, which the Amish don't usually come to Presbyterian services, but they were here for the dedication of the barn, and I can remember them sitting right up front. We have some incredible pictures of Josie standing out, looking over the land here. And he worked so hard for us to get the wood that we needed, because this wood, the height of the beams that go all the way down to the lower level, to go all the way through, and you couldn't find them. It took over a year and delayed the project. It came to be, but it took a while. So the benches were purchased and dedicated to different people in memory of, and so on. We still have a few that don't have plaques up here. Over the years, everything's changed. The banners used to be lower, and there were more of them. They're all handmade, and they have moved up a bit. We have speakers now that we didn't have initially. We have a screen that comes down, and that was a big thing because you can see the stone, you can see the cross here. And putting anything like speakers and things in front of that, there always are people who say, "You're going to do what?" So we've had a lot of that, but you are welcome back at any time. We do some beautiful musical events at Christmas. Alan was saying that Christmas he's been here, and he said the concerts are pretty amazing on Sunday evenings. They're Amish, all Amish built. Yeah. These are cherry. I was going to say, I've heard some of these things you hear over and over and over again when you have a pastor like David Redding here, 29 years, who talked about things like what kind of wood it was. And that's how I know about the hickory floors. And I just took pictures of some walnut pegs that are missing in a few places, because we have VBS in here. We have 300 kids at VBS and their parents, and you've got all those children, picking at things, or just over time, some of this wood loosens up. Yeah, so, some of them are missing, and our property manager said he's doing his best to try to find replacement pegs. We put a whole new outside to the barn because we got water damage. There was water and bees and all kinds of things, so we've completely redone the outside even since it was built. We also have had to work on the cupolas because they've had some leakage at times. and we think we've got that all done. We put on a new metal roof. Trying to think what else, any other questions that you might have? Sherry?
Have you mentioned anything about the pulpit?
About the pulpit being a fallen tree, and everything has symbolism to us. We're the fallen people, the fallen tree, and it was from the farm of one of our members. She comes back every once in a while. We'll see what happens.
The objects up there in front,
The objects.
the tools and.
Oh yeah, some of those things. You're going to want to wander around. Nancy, that's great that you mentioned that.
On the far left up front.
And
some
right.
Of the tools that they use to build the barn are kind of interesting.
Some of the planes and different things that they have, and up here you'll see some of the tools too.
Because they're not, they're not power tools. They're kind of interesting.
Did the church have an architect? I know it was a barn builder, but...
Yeah, yes, we had an architect. John Redding, David Redding's son, was the construction manager, along with Josie Miller from Plain City, and his son Junior. I know I saw architectural drawings. I don't know who did those. Okay, I don't know, actually the vision for this, David Redding, started sketching. It was just coming to him, the vision for it. But then I know we had architectural help along the way. I don't know how much John did as construction manager. I'm thinking quite a lot. One of the most beautiful places to be is up in the loft, looking down. So if you get a chance, you may want to, walk up there and kind of look down. These were really smooth and wonderful before COVID, and then they started spraying this stuff between services that kind of took some of the finish off. So I'm already talking with them about, can we use some kind of special sealer or something to help make this. It's not too bad, but over time we've talked about, we have communion cups between them. And glitter. Lots of glitter because of, yeah. You never know what you're going to find underneath these movable cushions here. And the benches are all movable. David Redding had the vision for having it set up this way, having the church set up so that the pulpit was over here. But then we realized when he actually we went all over the church, trying to see who couldn't see around these poles. And we realized that setting it up this way, more people had better vision of the pulpit and everything up there. And brides just love a long aisle. Other questions?
It is a beautiful church for a wedding.
It's a beautiful church for a wedding. Yeah. I think it's
Beautiful when they have the poinsettias here at Christmas.
yeah.
I think the most beautiful service was Maundy Thursday, when we, one by one, put the candles out and left silently in the dark.
Do you know,
That was very moving.
just sit there 1 minute and let me just turn on a little light, because that's what I did when I first came in.
Imagine leaving in the dark on Maundy Thursday.
This is a fun fact about the Native Americans here. We found the Indians numerous and friendly. Father being a gunsmith, Thomas Seller, they frequently came from Canada to have their guns repaired. They boarded with us while the work was being done. Many a night was the lower level of our one room covered with sleeping warriors while the family slept in the loft above. And this was written by John Flanagan Seller, Thomas Seller's son. If you can imagine the warriors sleeping down below and the family. I mean, I love the fun facts when you really read about. First-hand letters. Fun fact for the school. There was a bucket and a dipper at the entry of the school. When the supply became low, 2 pupils were allowed to go to the source for a pail of water. This was considered quite a desirable chore and sometimes was almost a date, as a boy would ask to go for water, then select his favorite girl to go along. The 2 had to go down the hill to the river's edge where there was a wonderful spring. If the boy was very gallant, he carried the water, but usually the bucket swung between them. And that's from Lucy Knapp Taggart, for whom Taggart wrote, the Taggart family on Taggart Road.
Can I tell a fun?
Tell a fun fact. Anybody can tell a fun fact.
This is okay. This is a fun fact. We understand, if it's true, that because some of the, as was mentioned earlier, that the pastors went around to other places to preach, that occasionally there was a different pastor in the little chapel, and his name was Titus Case. His house was, if you are at the river and you go east to Powell, it's at the, you had to come up the hill, and then it was on the south side of the road. Actually, it's where the new Powell Methodist Church is now. So this is where Titus Case lived, and he had a wife named Hannah. So Titus Case occasionally borrowed the chapel for him to preach in, and his wife was rather haughty, it was said, and not very well liked because of that. She would generally come late to chapel and to church so that she could make a grand entrance. So people did not particularly care for her. So they happened to have a well close to the road in front of their house, the Titus Case house at the top of the hill, where the new Powell Methodist Church is. So anyway, one day they awoke to find a sign leaning up against the cistern or the well there. The sign said, when Moses asked God for food in the wilderness, God gave him manna. When Titus Case asked for a wife, the devil gave him Hannah.
Oh, that's a fun fact, okay. That's a good one. Joseph Hughes had a lot of fun facts about him too, because he was quite a character, it's our understanding, our first pastor. And one of the things that he would do, and I read about this, there were lots of things about Joseph Hughes, but one of the things was that he would go to a wedding and marry the young couple, and then he'd pull out his fiddle and he'd play, and then he'd imbibe in whatever they were drinking, and he got called before the presbytery for that a number of times for different, he liked to play quoits. Quoits was like a horseshoe game that we used to have. I think probably somewhere around Liberty we have a set of quoits right now, because we used to have them, and during our historical days we'd bring them out and play them. But you throw and try to get close to these quoit things. And Joseph Hughes loved to play that, and he loved to win. And when he won, they drank. And again, he got called before the presbytery. So I think, he was having a lot of fun.
Now, were there a lot of, because this is a Presbyterian church, I mean, were a predominant, a larger number of Scottish in this area? I mean, versus like, I was talking to
Scotch
Sherry
Irish
earlier about the fact, in Powell, it was all Methodist. And yet, up here, then it's Presbyterian. So, would that indicate the different backgrounds or nationalities or whatever of the settlers in those areas? Or
I think, I think people just began settling and then writing letters. I don't have Prudence Power's letter with me, but I have it over there. I was going to read it to you and we didn't have time. But it's so powerful how people came here and then they wrote back home. So I'm guessing that, Scotch-Irish settled here and others in Powell a little further away like they do, and then you write your family and your friends and you say, hey, come on out. And who do you know? You know other Scotch-Irish who came in this settlement. But not all of them, because Seller is from Keller, which I believe is German, and I believe that's German. I would have to go back and look at it. I know Seller's from Kellar, and they changed it, and that's, you get a lot of that. But a lot of Scotch-Irish settled here, and Presbyterian persuasion. I don't know, though, if his wife or if his ancestry, once he got here, it's hard to know what happened there. But it is interesting. One of the things that Prudence Powers talks about is how long the journey was from the east, because it came down the Ohio River. And that was their path through the wilderness. And so they either walked beside the river or they took boats down the river and then keel boats up the Scioto. They came up to Franklinton and up at the Scioto and then to the Olentangy and would walk beside or take boats. And she just talked about how long and hard the journey was, and it was by the divine hand of providence, she said, that they even made it, that people were dying along the way, and some came by horseback, but they followed the rivers here. When Lucy Knapp Taggart wrote her memories of the old school, and I was reading that this week, pages of letter that she wrote, she was 71 years old. And she had been in one of these old schools as a child. And she had these vivid memories. And when you have that primary source, and you're reading it, and it's so rich. Otherwise we're just telling the story I wish I had Prudence Powers' letter right here, because it's just one page, but it's really powerful. We often read it on our history celebration Sundays. Any other questions, or thank you so much?
Well, thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
Go check out all the stuff you're telling.
Please do. Check out, roam around. You're welcome to.